6. Luke 6. And I meant to, text TJ the sermon title long before I did. I finally got it to you Wednesday, I think. But in fairness, the only response I got was, okay, thanks. He could have said, I'm lost. Can you give me some more criteria? Just put it out there. Luke 6. This is the first of what some people would say are 4 Sabbath controversies in Luke's gospel. And that means stories in which Jesus is accused of violating Sabbath law. Right? So the first one's 6, 1 through 5. The second one's right after it in 6, 6 through 11. Then we have to wait a while, but in chapter 13, 10 through 19, we get the third one, and the fourth one is in chapter 14. And it's kind of interesting because, Luke in his prologue says he's writing to Theophilus about the things that he has learned. And most would take, and I would too, that Theophilus is a Gentile, right? So what's Theophilus wanting to worry about Sabbath controversies, right? So why does Luke, the question becomes, why does Luke even include that in his account, right? And here's my answer for you, right? The Sabbath controversies reveal something about the identity of Jesus. I think it's easy to read the Sabbath controversies and think they're about all this legalism and what you do and don't do on the Sabbath. But I think they're included in Luke's gospel because he's wanting us to think beyond Sabbath to Lord of the Sabbath, right? And that's clearly the point of this account in Luke 6, 1 through 5. Three little points for us this morning. Maybe not so little, right? Okay. Remember what the Sabbath is, right? There's this controversial action on the Sabbath. In Luke 6:1, on a Sabbath, while he was going through the grain fields, his disciples plucked and ate some heads of grain, rubbing them in their hands. Sounds pretty innocent, doesn't it? The disciples are cutting through a field, probably at its edge, and as they go through, they pick some stalks, rub them in their hands, and break down the grain and eat it, right? Action seems innocent enough, but in the eyes of some, it's not appropriate for the Sabbath, as the disciples are about to discover, right? That's verse 2. There's this complaint about what they did. Some of the Pharisees. What the Pharisees are doing out at the grain field, I don't know. Right? Luke doesn't tell us. You suspect that they've planted themselves there to get something, but Luke doesn't say that's what's going on. But somehow the Pharisees know the disciples are in the grain field, right? And they say, why are you doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath? Now, I'm going to take a little side road here, but, and we're going to talk about two or three things. What this question is not about, right? They're saying, why do your disciples do what is not lawful on the Sabbath? This question is not about what day the Sabbath is it? That's nobody's saying this isn't the Sabbath day, right? Jesus knows what day the Sabbath is. Pharisees know what day the Sabbath is. The disciples know what day the Sabbath is. And it's pretty clear in the Bible what day the Sabbath is, according to, Exodus chapter 20 and verse 11, right? There's 6 days that God made, created the earth, the heavens and the earth. The seventh day he rested, and so the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Sabbath day, according to Exodus 20 and verse 11, then is given to Israel by God for a day of rest from creative activity. And see, it's God according to Exodus 20. And so one of the ways this could have been developed maybe with songs was something about rest. I don't know how many songs we have about rest either, but so I doubt if that would have increased our song list by very much right there, but maybe, you know. Right? And so one of the things going on is, you know, it's God's gift of rest and remembrance for them right there, right? And they know, the Jews knew what day that was, and that's what we call Saturday, right? That's Saturday. By contrast, you know, there was then for Christianity the first day of the week, right, which is Sunday, right? Acts chapter 20 and verse 7, where Christians come together on the first day of the week to break bread, to take of the Lord's Supper. And that's, you know, that's somehow through history, some of that's gotten confused. Right? And sometimes people will talk about a Christian Sabbath. Well, that's not biblical language. Right? The ancient church, when you read your Bible, right? Ancient church, first century church, knew Sabbath, Saturday, Sunday, first day of the week, Lord's Day, eighth day. They had several names for it, right? But it was that, okay? And increasingly, I think, as you progress through your New Testament, right? Sunday became known as the Lord's Day, right? I think, you know, I was in spirit on the Lord's Day, John writes in Revelation chapter 1, right? That was on Sunday, okay? But somewhere, you know, some of this confusion crept in. Part of it, y'all familiar with good old Emperor Constantine? Yeah, 321, you know, he made an edict in 321. But here what some people think then he made it the Christian Sabbath. He didn't. Constantine's edict made Sunday a civil day of rest for many occupations in the Roman Empire. Right? So it was a day of rest, right? And that kind of led some people to increasingly acquire the social characteristic. Sunday has now the social characteristic of the Sabbath, cessation from ordinary work. Okay? And so those two concepts started to kind of merge together. But the decisive movement that kind of confused these things came much later. By the medieval period, Christians increasingly interpreted Exodus 20 and verse 11, the fourth commandment, as having an abiding moral principle, and that God requires regular sacred rest and worship, and the principle was then applied by them to Sunday. So they're taking the fourth commandment principle and applying it to Sunday, not the Sabbath day. But the really, get my point? Strong place where things got really messed up came during the Reformation, 16th and 17th century, in Puritan and Reform thinking, and it's codified in the Westminster Confession. You probably have heard of that if you're familiar at all, especially Presbyterians and that strain. Westminster Confession, written in 1646 through 47, which states, the Sabbath was the last day of the week before Christ's resurrection, but was thereafter changed into the first day of the week, which should continue as the Christian Sabbath. So people, and that came to America with the whole, Jonathan Edwards and his revivalistic preaching. So that strain came on over here. But I'm telling you, the Westminster Confession is not my standard. How about you? Right? That's just not the standard. Okay? And so that whole thing is kind of this theological development after the New Testament, and it's clearly not Luke's terminology. When Luke writes Sabbath here in Luke 6, he means the seventh day, right? He means Saturday. And when he writes Sunday, he means the first day of the week. And you can see it almost back to back in his gospel in Luke chapter 23. In verse 54, it was the day of preparation. The Sabbath was beginning. The women who had come from the Galilee followed and saw the tomb and how his body was laid. Then they returned and prepared spices and ointments. On the Sabbath they rested. Right? On the Sabbath they rested according to the commandment. And then you get to 24:1, if I have. Did I miss it? I didn't get it in here. Sorry, I didn't get the right slide in, or else I'm out of order, which I might be. It's always possible with me. Well, let's just check that. Maybe I am out of trick. Yep, no, I didn't get it in. Okay, so if you've got your Bible, Luke 24:1, on the first day of the week, right? So they rested on the Sabbath, and then what? Now it's another day. On the first day of the week, at early dawn, they went to the tomb, taking spices they had prepared. Looks pretty clear. Sabbath, Saturday, first day of the week, Sunday, Resurrection Day, right? And so that's the way Luke uses it. That's the way I'm using it in this lesson. I think that's the way the Bible uses it, okay? And so here's the Sabbath, and I just do that because it gets confused, right? But the Pharisees and Jesus and the disciples weren't confused about that. So that's not what this controversy is, right? And the issue is not theft, because Deuteronomy 23 and verse 25 permitted someone, passing through a neighbor's grain field to pluck grain by the hand. So that's not the issue. It's not theft. What they're arguing about is faithfulness, what faithfulness to God looks like. Right? That's the issue that the Pharisees bring up. What does faithfulness to God look like on this day? Right? And so it concerns what constitutes work on the Sabbath. Okay? Because again, according to Exodus 20 and verse 11, it's supposed to be a day of rest, right? Where labor was prohibited. And of course, then you get all the questions going on about what's work? What's rest? Right? And so, this is where theology gets a bad name. People play around and don't, I guess, have anything better to do and figure out what work is. And so by the time of Jesus, you had, it wasn't written by his time, but it was already orally there by his time, that gets codified later in a Jewish document called the Mishnah. I don't know if you've heard of the Mishnah, right? And so they have these different sections of the Mishnah. And Shabbat, guess what that's about, right? Shabbat 7:2, and I didn't include all the categories of work just to give you, the generative categories of acts of labor. In other words, what is work? And what is work that's prohibited on the Sabbath? Are 40 less 1. And so what this is going to proceed is a 39 place category of what is work. Specified. These 39 things are work. And so you get the first one, He who sows, plows, reaps, binds sheaves, threshes, winnows, selects the fit from the unfit, grinds, sifts, kneads, bakes. And the list continues. I didn't think you'd probably want to have all 39 categories this morning, so I spared you from that. And I knew that we'd talk a long time at the first, so you wouldn't have time for it anyway. Okay? But according to this detailed and specific list, these disciples, they were reaping. They were threshing. Ooh. They were winnowing. Oh, no. And they were preparing food. I mean, they quadruply broke the Sabbath. What bad boys, right? At least that's what the Pharisees think, right? That's what's going on. And so they bring this up, they raise this question, for Jesus. And what that, I'm taking some time in this, but where we've got some relevance here, folks, is that we can become so concerned with protecting God's commands that our rules obscure God's purposes. Right? And that's kind of what's going on with the Pharisees here, right? Because the Sabbath itself was good, was it not? It was a gift of God to Israel. Okay? The problem is not taking the Sabbath seriously, right? The Pharisees are taking the Sabbath seriously. The problem was assuming that their understanding and their interpretation of Sabbath and what constituted work faithfully either represented, or you might say even better, protected, right, God's intention. Because it gets stated in the Mishnah that the Pharisees intended in these rules to set a fence around the Torah, right? In other words, how do you know you're not going to violate God's law, God's instructions? Well, if we construct a fence around the instructions and you never cross the fence, then you've never violated the instructions, right? The problem with that is what? The fence becomes the standard. The fence becomes the standard. And that's not from God. The intention may be good to put the fence there, but now you've created a standard that supersedes God's standards. And so there's always this danger that our traditions about Scripture become kind of indistinguishable in our minds from Scripture itself. Okay? And so we've got to continually ask ourselves, are we obeying what God actually said or what we've come to assume that God has said? Okay? Point 2. Remember what the Sabbath is for. Jesus responds to their question, their accusation, with the story of David and the consecrated bread from 1 Samuel chapter 21, verses 1 and 2, or 1 through 6, excuse me. Jesus answered them, "Have you not read what David did when he was hungry?" Well, what a great way to respond, isn't it? Have you not read, talking to Pharisees? And they're going to think, sure, we've read that. And I don't think Jesus is questioning whether they've read it or not. When he says, have you not read, he's saying, did you read it and miss the point? Because we can read things and miss the point, can't we? I have found that true of myself in life. And I'm sure there are still some points I am missing, right? And when we get done, some of you may want to inform me of that. I don't know, but I think that's what he's saying with this. I know you've read it, but you're kind of missing the point here, right? Have you not read what David did when he was hungry? He and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God and took and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat, and also gave it to those with him. So he brings up this David and the bread of presence, which had restrictions on it to only the priests to eat, okay? And that's not David, is it? David and his men are not the priests. And yet, he's hungry, they're hungry, and they eat the bread of presence because they needed something to eat. And like Jesus' disciples, right? This is the analogy Jesus is doing. Disciples are hungry. Here's some food. They're going to eat it, right? You think it's not good on the Sabbath? You think it's not good for the bread of presence. And then the question becomes, what point is Jesus making? Right? What's he saying with this? And I think there's a superficial answer that comes to that question that's pretty widespread. And I think the superficial answer is that human need always overrides biblical commands, and I think that's a bad answer. So remember how I started with you? Why does Luke include Sabbath controversies? Because, there is something more profound than that going on in this text. Let's look at not just about David's men being hungry and Jesus' disciples being hungry, but think about who David was and who Jesus is, because that's where Jesus takes this conversation at the end in verse 5. Right? And that's why I can stand and say this. David is the Lord's anointed, is he not? Everybody can agree on that? He's doing God's work, he's on God's mission, and it's through him that the Messiah is coming. Who's Jesus? He's that coming Messiah, isn't he? There's a parallel between David and Jesus going on here that I think is at the heart of this answer. Not about human needs and biblical commands, but about person. Because that's where he takes it in verse 5, okay? And so I think that's where he's pushing people when he that's the point he wants the Pharisees to think about when he asks this and brings up the David and his men story out of 1 Samuel 21. Third point. And that's where this is driving. Remember who the Lord of the Sabbath is. Right? And he said to them, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Right? Jesus, as Lord of the Sabbath, is authorized to fulfill his mission despite Sabbath regulations. He's different, right? And Jesus is different, and he's authorized to decide when Sabbath regulations must be set aside to fulfill a greater divine purpose. Because he really never argues whether what they did was lawful or not. What he says is what? I'm the Lord of the Sabbath. That means I have the right to determine what can happen on the Sabbath. Isn't that true? Isn't that what's going on? He doesn't stand outside Sabbath, right? Criticizing it. No, Jesus as Lord of the Sabbath stands over. He stands above Sabbath as its Lord. And his presence there means the arrival of the new period has come. And Jesus possesses unique authority. And Jesus isn't just another teacher, not just a great example, not a moral religious leader like other greats of history. Jesus possesses authority over laws and institutions that God has ordained. Jesus is Lord, right? Earlier in Luke's Gospel, chapter 5 and verse 24, Jesus is the one who is the Son of Man who has authority on earth to forgive sins. Right? Now he's the Lord of the Sabbath, which talks about his authority going on. So that's where he's pushing this whole conversation when he's talking to the Pharisees and brings up David and his men. Now, specifically, what's going on with Jesus as Lord of the Sabbath? When we think of Sabbath commandment, I think most of us will go to the text I've already shown you. Exodus chapter 20 and verse 11. Right? And we know the connection in Exodus 20:11 is what? Rest. That's the connection there, right? God created for 6 days. Sabbath day means God's rest. But Deuteronomy, it's got to get a different reason. Right? I'm still having trouble. There we go. That's who I want. Deuteronomy. Jesus as Lord of the Sabbath brings God's freedom. Here, Deuteronomy 6. Observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy as the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter or your male servant, your female servant, your ox, your donkey, or any of your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates, that your male servant and your female servant may rest as well as you. Why are you doing this? You shall remember that you were slaves. You were slaves in the land of Egypt. And the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God commanded you to keep Sabbath day. Do you hear the difference going on between that and Exodus 20? Exodus 20 and verse 11, Deuteronomy 6, both talk about the Sabbath command, but they give different reasons for keeping Sabbath command. What? You imitate God and rest. You remember you were a slave. Both of those are legitimate, aren't they? But in Luke's gospel, I think he's really drawing on the Deuteronomy text. Okay? Because for Israel, the Sabbath did not merely mean stop working. The Sabbath was also a reminder that you are no longer a slave. And Israel was to rest because God delivered slaves from bondage. And so the Sabbath was a sign of liberation, and that is enormously important to Luke. Luke 4, excuse me. Jesus comes to Nazareth. And this is pretty programmatic statement of Jesus' ministry right here as Luke has it. Where he had been brought up, and as was his custom, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath. And by the way, synagogue worship on the Sabbath was never prescribed in the Mosaic legislation. Neither of those texts in Exodus 20 or Deuteronomy 6 mention the Sabbath as a day of worship per se, do they? They are a day to rest and reflect. That's what they were to Israel. By the time of Jesus, other things had occurred to it, right? And so he goes to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, and he stood to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him, and he unrolled the scroll and found the place where it's written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me. He's anointed me." See, there's a connection to David right there, right? To proclaim good news to the poor, to proclaim liberty to the captives, recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. And the eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on him. And he began to say to them, "Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." And the way Luke records his gospel pulls that out for us. And Luke's Sabbath controversies, or Luke's Sabbath stories, begin to demonstrate what Jesus announced in that synagogue in Nazareth in Luke chapter 4, right? So notice what Luke does on Sabbaths, Jesus does on Sabbaths in Luke. He restores the man's withered hand, right? There was something about healing the lame, wasn't there, in that programmatic thing? That's the Sabbath controversy in Luke 6 through 11. He releases a woman who has been bound for 18 years in Luke 13. I think that's something like what he said he was doing in Luke chapter 4. And in Luke 14, Jesus heals a suffering man. All of those things are part of what he said his mission is about. See, the Lord of the Sabbath, hopefully that's right. That's one behind. The Lord of the Sabbath releases captives, restores broken people, confronts evil, and gives life.